The first time Grace Wells heard the name Vernon Redmond, she was sitting in the back of a rattling stagecoach with dust settling into her collar and a Colt revolver pressed against her hip, and the woman across from her leaned in close and said, "Whatever you do, girl, do not ride through Redmond land." Grace had arrived in the territory of New Mexico in the spring of 1878 with 2 leather trunks, a deed to 40 acres her late father had left her in a handwritten will, and the kind of quiet, bone-deep resolve that only comes from having nothing left to lose. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, with green eyes that people sometimes described as unsettling because they did not look away when they should. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher who believed that women ought to know how to read contracts as well as cookbooks, and she had buried that father only 3 months ago in the cold Missouri ground, standing alone in the rain because her mother had gone years before and there was no one else. The 40 acres her father had left her were located just outside the town of Cordoba, New Mexico, a small but stubborn collection of buildings that included a general store, a livery, a church, a saloon that doubled as a courtroom, and a post office barely large enough to turn around in. The deed had come with a letter in her father's handwriting explaining that he had won the land in a card game in 1871 and had always meant to go west and start something. He never had. Grace figured she would do it for both of them. The woman in the stagecoach was named Mrs. Della Faro, and she was returning to Cordoba after visiting her sister in Santa Fe. She was a stout woman in her 50s with a face weathered by wind and opinion, and she seemed to know everything about everyone in a 50-mile radius. "Vernon Redmond," Mrs. Faro said, dropping her voice as if the man himself might be riding alongside them, "owns the Broken Spur Ranch, biggest operation in the county. They say he runs 12,000 acres and more cattle than most counties have people." "That sounds like a successful man," Grace said carefully. "Successful," Mrs. Faro repeated, as if the word tasted wrong. "That is one word for it. Another word is ruthless. Another is cruel. Drove 3 families off their land because he wanted their water rights. Had a man thrown in jail on a false claim just because the man looked at his fence line wrong. They say he has never once smiled in public. They say he does not drink or gamble or visit the saloon, not because he is virtuous, but because he does not see the point in any pleasure that does not serve a purpose." She paused and folded her hands in her lap. "They say he once left a farmhand out on the desert plain with no horse and no water for talking back to him." "Is that true?" Grace asked. "I do not know if every single story is true, but I know that not one person in Cordoba County would cross him, and the ones who tried ended up leaving the territory or worse." Mrs. Faro fixed her with a steady look. "Where exactly is your land?" Grace told her. Mrs. Faro was quiet for a moment. "That puts you right up against his western boundary." The stagecoach hit a rut and they both grabbed for the overhead strap. "Well," Grace said, once they had steadied themselves, "I suppose I will have to be neighborly." Mrs. Faro looked at her as though she had just said something either very brave or very foolish, and Grace suspected the woman had not yet decided which. Cordoba was smaller than Grace had expected, which was saying something because she had not expected much. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass and was packed dirt that turned to mud in rain and to a fine powder in sun. There was a hitching post in front of nearly every building. Children ran between the legs of horses without apparent concern. The smell of the place was hay and leather and wood smoke, and underneath all of it the dry sage smell of the desert, which Grace found she liked immediately. She took a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Emmeline Cross, who was thin and efficient and asked no unnecessary questions, but made a breakfast of eggs and cornbread that could make a person believe in the goodness of the world. Grace spent her first week in Cordoba riding out to inspect her land on a hired horse from the livery, making herself known to the shopkeepers, and listening. She learned that Cordoba had a sheriff named Holt Briggs who was decent enough but careful around Vernon Redmond. She learned that the man ran his ranch with a crew of about 20 cowhands, and that his foreman was a veteran cowboy named Dale Purvis, who had been with Redmond for 10 years, and who people spoke of with a kind of resigned respect. She learned that Redmond had come to the territory from Texas when he was 20 years old, had built the broken spur from nothing over 12 years, and was now 32 with a reputation that preceded him like storm weather. She also learned that her 40 acres, which sat along a creek called Mather's Creek, had soil good enough for vegetables and grain, that the creek ran clean and steady, and that 2 families had tried to farm the same parcel in the past 5 years and had both left within a season. Both departures, she was told by the man at the general store, a cheerful fellow named Amos Finch, had happened after some kind of disagreement with the broken spur. "What kind of disagreement?" Grace asked, leaning on the counter. Amos Finch glanced toward the window as if checking for listeners. "The kind that is more of a one-sided conversation," he said. "Redmond wants that creek water. His eastern pastures have been drying up because of where he positioned his main irrigation lines. Mather's Creek would fix the problem entirely. He has offered to buy the parcel twice. Both times the owners refused, and then both times they found reasons to leave pretty quickly after that." "What kind of reasons?" "Fence posts pulled up, water trough poisoned. One family, the Garcias, their barn burned in the night." Amos said this last part quietly. Nobody could prove a thing. Grace took this in with the particular stillness she brought to difficult news. She thanked him, purchased flour, salt, bacon, a tin of coffee, and a box of cartridges for her Colt, and walked out into the white New Mexico sun. She spent the next 2 weeks setting up her claim. She had enough money from the sale of her father's house in Missouri to buy a modest amount of lumber, a sturdy canvas tent to sleep in while she worked, seed, basic tools, and a horse. She bought the horse from the livery, a steady bay mare she called Nell, and she bought her from an old Navajo man named Thomas, who ran a small string of horses in a corral just at the edge of town. He looked her over when she paid without haggling, and nodded once with something that might have been approval. She dug a foundation for a small cabin. She fixed the fence lines that had been torn up by her predecessors. She planted what she could for the late season. She made peace with the scorpions and the lizards and the particular loneliness of sleeping in a tent in the desert when the wind came down from the mountains and made the canvas shake like something alive. Her neighbors, such as they were, came to see her. There was a Mexican family called the Vargas family, who lived a mile south on a homestead with a vegetable garden and 4 children, and a manner of cautious friendliness that Grace appreciated for its honesty. The mother, Rosa Vargas, brought her tamales on her 3rd day on the land and stayed for an hour and told her plainly that she thought Grace was brave for coming and that she should watch the north fence line. "That is where they come," Rosa said, without specifying who. "Just watch it." There was also a young man who rode out on the 4th day, a rider from the broken spur, and he pulled up at her tent and looked down at her with the practiced disinterest of someone carrying a message they didn't write. He said Mr. Redmond would like to speak with her at her convenience, and that she was welcome to ride to the ranch house any day she chose. "Please tell Mr. Redmond I'll come when my fence is finished," Grace said pleasantly, driving a post into the ground with a mallet that was slightly too heavy for her. The rider looked uncertain, as though the concept of a response other than immediate compliance had not occurred to him. He rode away without another word. She finished her fence. She let a full week pass after the message. Then, on a Tuesday morning when the sky was a particular shade of clear blue that seemed to have no end to it, she saddled Nell and rode north to the Broken Spur. The Broken Spur Ranch was not what she expected, and she was beginning to understand that nothing in New Mexico was going to be what she expected. The ranch house was large but not showy, built from good adobe and timber with a wide covered porch and a working yard that showed real industry. There were barns, outbuildings, a bunkhouse, corrals with horses that were better quality than almost anything she'd seen. The whole place was orderly in the way of something run by someone who cared about function over appearance. A man came out to meet her before she reached the gate. He was 50s lean, with a face like cracked leather and eyes that assessed her the way you assess potential trouble. This was Dale Purvis, the foreman, and she knew it without being told. "Miss Wells," he said, not a question. "Mr. Purvis, I would guess," she said. "I understand Mr. Redmond wished to speak with me." "He does." Purvis studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I will say this to you plainly, ma'am. Mr. Redmond is not an easy man. He is direct, and he does not spend much time on pleasantries. I would advise you not to take offense where none is meant." "I appreciate the warning," Grace said, and she meant it. She was shown into a room that served as an office, a spare place with a desk, 2 chairs, a map of the county on the wall with the broken spur marked in red, and a window that looked out onto the eastern pasture. She waited. Vernon Redmond came into the room with the particular economy of movement that belongs to men who have spent years in spaces where every action has a consequence. He was tall and broad in the shoulder, with dark hair worn close, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red rock as the landscape, and eyes of a particular dark brown that she would later spend considerable time trying to describe accurately and always fail at. He was dressed simply, a plain shirt, and wore trousers and boots that had seen serious use. He looked exactly like a man who had spent 12 years building an empire from dry earth with his own hands, which was to say he looked like someone who had not slept enough in a decade. He stopped just inside the doorway, looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read, and then sat down behind the desk. "Miss Wells," he said. His voice was deep and steady and carried a slight Texas roughness he'd never lost. "I am Vernon Redmond." "I know who you are," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise. "I expect you have heard things about me." "I have heard quite a lot of things about you," Grace said calmly. "I try to form my own opinions about people." He was quiet for a moment. This, she would learn later, was characteristic of him. Vernon Redmond did not speak to fill silence. "I will come to it directly then. I want to purchase your parcel." "I know that too," she said. "I'll offer you twice the market value. That is more than fair." "It is more than fair," she agreed. "But I have no intention of selling." He looked at her steadily. Not angry, not blustering, just measuring. "You intend to farm it, and run some livestock, yes." "The soil along Mathers Creek is good," he said, and she detected something reluctant in the admission, as if he were paying a compliment to an opponent. "But that is a hard 40 acres to manage alone." "Many things worth doing are hard to manage alone," Grace said. The silence stretched out again. Outside, a horse moved in the corral, and somewhere in the yard, a man was shouting instructions about something involving rope. "You know I need that creek water," Redmond said. "I know your east pastures are running dry," she said. "I spoke with Mr. Finch." He glanced down at the desk briefly, and she could see the calculation running behind his eyes. "I could offer you a water-sharing arrangement along with the purchase price. You would walk away with enough money to set yourself up very comfortably elsewhere." "Mr. Redmond," Grace said, and she kept her voice entirely even, "my father left me that land. He wanted to come west and start something, and he never got the chance. I intend to do it in his name. I appreciate your offers, and I mean no disrespect to your needs, but I will not be selling. If you want to discuss a genuine water-sharing arrangement while I remain on the land, I am open to that conversation. But that is the only conversation I am available for." He looked at her for a long time. Not the way men sometimes looked at her, assessing her as a woman. He was assessing her as a person, and she had the odd sensation that he was surprised to find one present. "All right," he said at last. "I will think on the water-sharing matter. You will hear from me." She stood, and he stood a half-second later out of a courtesy that seemed almost unconscious, as if it had been trained into him long ago and lived in his body independent of any conscious intention. "One more thing," Grace said, at the door. "Whatever happened with the previous families on that land? I want you to know I am aware of it, and I am not leaving." The The silence that followed was of a different quality than the others. She could not tell what moved behind his face in that moment. She walked out to Nell and rode home. She told nobody about the meeting except Rosa Vargas, who came by 3 days later with more tamales and an expression of cautious respect. "You went to the Broken Spur and came back looking like that," Rosa said, gesturing at Grace's settled, unconcerned expression. "Like what? Like nothing happened." "Nothing did happen," Grace said. "We had a conversation." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "My cousin talked back to him once, back in '74. He lost the contract for his wagon work." Grace poured coffee for both of them. "I didn't talk back, I just told him my intentions. And he said he would think about it." Rosa stared at her. "He said he would think about it." "Yes. Not no riders at your fence line, no missing fence posts." "Not yet," Grace said, "but I have my Colt." Rosa laughed, the first genuine laugh Grace had heard from her, and it was a good sound, warm and real, and Grace felt something in her chest loosen slightly, the particular loneliness of being new to a place beginning to ease. The weeks passed and the summer deepened into the dry, ferocious heat of a New Mexico August. Grace worked her land with the single-mindedness of someone who had decided to succeed and did not particularly entertain the alternative. She finished the walls of her cabin with help from the Vargas family's oldest son, a 16-year-old named Miguel who was strong and serious and accepted wages with dignity. She got her bean crop in, tended her creek, kept her fence. She rode into Cordoba twice a week for supplies and news. She saw Vernon Redmond twice in town during those weeks, and each time she had the peculiar experience of him spotting her across the street or across the room and acknowledging her with a nod that contained considerably more in it than a nod should. She nodded back and went about her business. She heard stories about him constantly. Everyone had one. He had refused to extend credit to a farmer who then lost his land. He had fired a cowhand on Christmas Day. He had once ridden 20 miles in a thunderstorm to confront a man over a disputed fence line, and had arrived at the man's door soaking wet and entirely composed, and had stayed until the matter was resolved to his satisfaction. "Do you think he is actually cruel?" Grace asked Mrs. Farrow, who she had taken to having dinner with on Sundays at the boarding house. "Or do you think he is simply unyielding?" "I think there is not a great deal of difference from the outside," Mrs. Farrow said. "There is quite a lot of difference," Grace said. "Cruelty takes pleasure in the pain of others. Unyielding is just stubborn. One says something about a person's character, the other just says they are difficult." Mrs. Farrow looked at her with the particular expression she'd learned to recognize, the one that meant the older woman was reassessing something. "You are thinking of him a great deal for someone who has only met him once." "I am trying to understand my situation," Grace said, which was true enough. The water-sharing proposal came from Dale Purvis, not from Redmond himself, which Grace suspected meant something. Purvis rode out on a Wednesday morning with a written document, which she found interesting. She read it carefully. It was reasonable, more than reasonable, actually. She would retain full ownership of the land and the creek frontage. The Broken Spur would have access to creek water for the east pastures between the hours of 6 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon via a channel that they would dig and maintain entirely at their own expense. In return, she would receive a payment each year and access to Broken Spur veterinary services for her livestock. She looked up from the document at Purvis, who was watching her from under the brim of his hat with the expression of a man who had been sent to do something he found mildly surprising. "This is very fair," she said. "Mr. Redmond is a fair man," Purvis said, and said it in a tone that made her wonder whether he was stating his own opinion or repeating something he'd been told to say. "I have a few small changes I'd like to propose," she said. Purvis looked momentarily as though he was not certain he had heard correctly. "Nothing large," she said pleasantly. "Just clarifications about the dry season and what happens if the creek level drops." Purvis took her proposed additions back to the Broken Spur. The revised version came back 3 days later with her changes incorporated, and a single additional clause that addressed a concern she hadn't raised but that was sensible to address. She signed it. Purvis witnessed it. They shook hands and he rode away, and she stood in the September sun watching the dust of his horse and thinking about the single additional clause, about whether Redmond had read her document closely enough to anticipate the issue she hadn't raised, and concluded that he had. She wanted to be honest with herself. She had been curious about Vernon Redmond from the moment she first heard his name, and not only in the practical way of a woman who shares a fence line with a powerful man. There was something in the fragments of information she kept assembling about him that did not add up neatly to cruelty, though she would not have said this out loud because she had nothing solid to stand the opinion on. She had only a negotiation conducted through a foreman that resulted in a fair contract, a first meeting in which he had not threatened her despite having done worse to others, and a series of town stories that she was beginning to understand were told primarily by people who had wanted something from him that he hadn't given them. This was not proof of anything. She knew that. She kept her Colt cleaned and loaded and she watched her north fence line. Then came the morning of the foal. It was October by then, and the mornings had taken on the sharp, clean cold of the New Mexico autumn, the kind that bites at your face but leaves the sky a color of blue so pure it seems unreal. Grace had taken to rising before dawn because she liked that hour, the world still dark and quiet and smelling of sage and cold air, and she would stand on her porch with coffee and watch the sky change. It was a thing she had done with her father in Missouri and had kept up from habit and from something closer to necessity, because the dawn was where she put herself back together after the previous day. On this particular morning she had risen before 4 o'clock with the vague unease she sometimes felt before she could name why. She had made coffee, pulled on her coat, and walked out with the mug warming her hands. The sky was just beginning to show its first pale suggestion at the eastern edge, the stars still bright overhead, and the air was absolutely still and cold. She heard it after a few minutes, a sound she couldn't immediately identify, low and broken, coming from the north, from the direction of the broken spur's eastern pasture, just the other side of her fence line. She stood very still, listening. Then she went inside, set down her mug, picked up her rifle out of habit, and walked north through the dark toward her fence. She smelled the place before she reached it, the particular warm animal smell of horses, and something underneath it that was sadder than that. She came to the fence line and looked through the pre-dawn gray and saw first the shape of the mare, standing, and then the much smaller shape on the ground, and then the man. He was kneeling in the grass beside the dead foal with his back to her, and he had his face in one hand, and he was weeping. Not quietly the way men sometimes weep when they think no one can see them and they are trying to be efficient about it. He was weeping in the way that people weep when the thing that is broken is something they cared about past the point of caution, a raw, real sound that carried in the still cold air like something wounded. His other hand rested on the foal's flank, motionless. Grace stood very still at the fence line. The mare turned her head and looked at Grace with the great liquid patience of horses, and then looked back at the foal. Grace did not know how long she stood there. Long enough for the sky to lighten another degree, for the stars to begin to fade at the eastern edge. Long enough to understand that what she was seeing was not a performance and not a moment she should intrude on. Then something gave in her. She did not make a conscious decision. She just opened the gate in her fence, the one she'd installed for her own access to the creek, and walked through it and walked toward him. He heard her when she was still several yards away, and his head came up and he turned fast, the way a man turns when he has been caught in something private, his hand going automatically toward a gun at his hip that wasn't there, because he had come out here at dawn the way people go to private places, without preparation for being seen. His face in the early light was not what she expected. She had been told the cruelest man in the territory. What she saw was a man with grief on him like weather, raw and present, his eyes red in the growing dawn light, his jaw set with the effort of a man trying to reassemble himself under conditions of shock. They looked at each other across the few yards of cold grass and the silent body of the foal. "I am sorry," Grace said. It was the first thing she thought of, and it was the right thing. Vernon Redmond looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him decide something about her in that moment. She saw it happen the way you sometimes see a lock turn. "She was too early," he said. His voice was rough. "I was here. I sat with the mare all night, and I came back at first light and the foal was already gone." How old was the mare? 7. He looked back down at the foal, her first. She was my best horse's first foal. He was not ashamed of the tears. Or if he was not willing to pretend the reason for them was not worth the shame. And Grace thought this was one of the more honest things she had ever encountered. She walked closer and crouched down on the other side of the foal and put her hand on its neck the way she would have done if it had been alive, and felt the cold of it and said nothing. The mare stepped closer and put her nose down to the foal and then to Grace's shoulder, and Vernon Redmond watched this happen with an expression she would spend months trying to describe to herself and never quite manage. "How did you hear it?" he asked after a while. "I was on my porch," she said. "I rise early." "So do I," he said. "Usually." They stayed there together with the dead foal and the living mare while the sky continued its slow change from gray to pale gold, and Grace was aware of the cold and the sage smell and the immense quiet of the land and the man across from her who was nothing like what she had been told. He did not ask her to leave, and she did not go until he began to rise, and then she rose with him. They stood facing each other in the young light, and she saw his face more clearly now, the lines of it, the tiredness, the thing that was grief but also something else that she could not quite name, something that looked like a man recognizing something unexpected. "Miss Wells," he said. "Grace," she said because it seemed right. He was quiet for a moment as if weighing something. "Vernon," he said. She nodded. "Your mare is going to need watching today." "I know," he said. "Dale will see to her." "If you need anything from my side of the fence," she said, and left it there. He looked at her for a moment, and something moved in his face that she could not fully interpret, only sense. "I'll bear that in mind," he said. She walked back to her side of the fence and did not look back, though she was aware of him watching until she was out of sight. She sat with her cold coffee for a long time after that and thought about the sound she had heard in the dark, and about what it took for a man who everyone said felt nothing to make that sound over a foal that had never lived, and she thought that something was not adding up in what she had been told and what she had seen, and the discrepancy seemed important. 2 days later, Dale Purvis arrived at her place with the information that Mr. Redmond wished to know if she was available for supper at the Broken Spur on Friday evening, if she was willing, and that he understood if she was not. The last part, Purvis said with a slight awkwardness that told her it was a direct quotation. She said yes. She wore the blue dress that had been her best in Missouri and remained her best here, and she rode Nell to the Broken Spur on a Friday evening when the sky was orange and purple at the edges, and the first chill of proper autumn was in the air. A ranch hand took her horse, and she was shown to the main house where supper had been laid in a dining room that was plain but clean, with candles on the table and the smell of good beef and coffee. Vernon was already there when she arrived, and he stood when she came in, which again had the quality of unconscious habit, manners learned early and kept. He looked, she noticed, as if he had made an effort with his appearance, a clean shirt, hair combed, a slight tension around the jaw that told her he was less comfortable with this than he would like to be. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for the invitation," she said. A Mexican woman named Consuelo, who was the ranch cook, brought beef and beans and fresh cornbread and more food than 2 people could manage, and Grace suspected this was Consuelo's particular way of being welcoming, which she appreciated. They ate and talked, and the talking was halting at first, because neither of them was particularly given to conversation for its own sake, and so they found a rhythm that was slightly different from most dinner conversations, more direct, with longer pauses, as if they were both more comfortable with accuracy than with comfort. He asked about her father. She told him plainly, without excessive grief, about the Missouri schoolteacher who had believed in going west and never made it. "He sounds like a man who had good intentions," Vernon said. "He did," Grace said. "He was sometimes better at the intention than the action, but the 40 acres were real enough. What do you intend to do with it in the long term?" She looked at him across the table. "Exactly what I am doing. Build something, make it work. I intend to run a small herd eventually and keep the garden, and perhaps offer some boarding to travelers once the cabin is properly finished." "You plan to stay," he said, not a challenge. Almost something closer to relief, though she was not sure enough of that to name it. "I plan to stay," she confirmed. He refilled her coffee without asking because it had gone empty, and it was the obvious thing to do, and she found this simplicity oddly moving. "Can I ask you something direct?" she said. He looked up. "You can. The families before me on that land, the Garcias, the other one, did you arrange for them to leave?" The question sat in the room. She watched him take it in, watched him decide what to do with it. He set his coffee cup down. "No," he said, "not directly." "What does that mean?" "It means I made clear to Dale that I wanted that land, and I believe Dale took actions I did not specifically authorize. I found out after the fact." He paused. "I did not adequately address it when I found out. That is its own failing." It was, she thought, one of the more honest admissions she had ever heard a man make about something that reflected poorly on him. "And the Garcia barn? That was never proven," he said. "And I genuinely do not know. But I know what people believe, and I know what I should have done differently." He looked directly at her. "I did not come to this territory to be a decent man in the small ways. I came to build something. I let the building of it be more important than the decency for too many years." He stopped. "I don't know why I am telling you this." "Because I asked," she said, "and because you are not accustomed to people asking things they actually want the true answer to." He looked at her for a long moment, and the candles between them made the light unsteady and warm, and she was aware of how quiet the room was and how close the desert outside, and how entirely, surprisingly herself, she felt sitting here with this man who was nothing like what she had expected. "That's accurate," he said. He walked her to her horse when the evening was done, and the stars were enormous and the air had gone cold and sharp, and they stood for a moment in the yard. "I would like to do this again," he said, with the directness that was, she was learning, simply his native mode. "I would too," she said, equally direct. She rode home in the dark with the stars above her, and something lit up in her chest that she recognized eventually as happiness, plain and unexpected and real. He came to her land the following week himself, without Purvis, to inspect the progress of the water channel his crew had been digging. She walked the line with him, pointing out a place where she thought the slope was wrong, and he looked at it and agreed and called to the 2 men working it, and they adjusted it. He moved the way he spoke, without waste, without exhibition. She found herself watching his hands, which were the hands of someone who actually worked, scarred and strong and entirely comfortable with tools and rope and whatever was in front of them. They had coffee at her cabin when the inspection was done, standing outside because the interior was still too rough for company, and he told her about the broken spur in those years before it became what it was, about arriving in New Mexico at 20 with 2 horses and a small amount of money and a will to build something that he could never quite explain the origin of, even to himself. "Did you have family?" she asked. "A mother in Texas," he said. "She died in 73. No father worth the name." "I'm sorry, you said that to me once before," he said, "about the foal. I meant it both times." He looked at her with something that was almost undefended, which seemed rare on his face, a face that was generally arranged with the careful control of a man who has learned that showing too much is a cost he cannot afford. "I know you did," he said. "That is the thing." She thought about him constantly after that, and was annoyed with herself for it, and then stopped being annoyed with herself because it was October in New Mexico, and the light was gold and something real was happening between them, and she was not going to waste it on pretending it wasn't. He came back that weekend and the one after. They rode the land together, her land and the border of his, and the conversations they had ranged further and further from practical matters into territory that felt like the real territory, the actual landscape of who each of them was. She told him about growing up with a father who taught her to read contracts and shoot a rifle and think for herself, and about the years when she had half expected to get married and had watched every man who approached her and found that what she wanted was someone she could talk to honestly, and none of them had been that. He told her, haltingly, and with the quality of someone revealing things they did not have much practice revealing, that he had spent 12 years building the broken spur and had looked up at the end of it to find that he was alone in a very large house, and that he had not previously thought this was the kind of thing that mattered to him, and had discovered fairly recently that he had been wrong about that. How recently? She asked, with a directness that made the color in his face shift slightly. Since October, he said. She looked at him. Of this year, he added, which was entirely unnecessary and somehow made it better. They were sitting on the fence between their properties when he said this, in the late afternoon light, and she looked at him sitting there with his boots hooked on the lower rail, and the sun on his face making him look younger than his 32 years, and less like the cruelest man in the territory, and more like a man who had worked very hard for a long time, and had forgotten to pay attention to anything that wasn't work. And she thought that what she felt for him was something more serious than she had been prepared for, and that was all right. "I think you should kiss me," she said. He turned and looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something that might have been relief, and he leaned across the fence and did exactly that, with a directness that was entirely consistent with everything else about him, and it was honest and warm and exactly right. And when they separated, she was looking at him and he was looking at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing necessary to say. "I've been wanting to do that for a month," he said, eventually. "I know," she said. "Was it that obvious?" "Only to me," she said. "I was paying attention." November brought cold nights and brilliant days, and the two of them moved through the weeks in the particular way of people who have found something they did not know they were looking for, and are handling it with care because it matters. He brought his horse to her fence line 2 and 3 times a week. She rode to the broken spur for supper on Fridays, which became a standing arrangement that Consuelo seemed to regard with great satisfaction, augmenting the Friday meals with a steadily escalating ambition that Grace found both touching and occasionally overwhelming. She met the cowhands and ranch hands of the broken spur, a varied assortment of men from Texas and New Mexico and Mexico itself, and found that among them Vernon was held in a regard that was more complex than simple fear. They respected him, clearly, the way you respect someone who knows what they are doing and holds their standards consistently. But there was also something warmer than that among the longer-serving ones, Dale Purvis and a Mexican cowboy named Santiago, and an older man they called Capper who had been with the operation since the first year and who called Vernon boss, with an affection that could not be faked. She asked Capper about it once directly, the way she asked everything. "He's hard," Capper said. "I won't say otherwise. He don't bend and he don't give easy credit and he expects a man to do what he says he'll do. But he's fair. He pays well. He's never once left a man stranded when something went wrong, personal or otherwise." He paused. "People who say cruel usually mean a man who won't give them something they want. That ain't the same as cruel." The dispute with the Garcia family was something Grace, eventually, came to understand more fully through a combination of Rosa Vargas and old Amos Finch, and her own patience with piecing things together. Dale Purvis had, on his own initiative and without Vernon's direct knowledge, pressured both families on the parcel, and the barn fire had been the work of a ranch hand named Cole Dawes, who Purvis had kept on longer than was wise, and who was gone now, dismissed. And the whole situation had the quality of something Vernon had allowed to happen through inattention rather than intention. which was not innocent exactly, but was also not the same as what the stories suggested. She told Vernon what she'd pieced together one evening in early December, sitting in his kitchen with coffee while the wind came down from the mountains and rattled the windows. "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to exonerate myself." "I'm not trying to exonerate you either," she said. "I'm trying to understand the difference between what you are and what people say you are. And what have you concluded?" She looked at him steadily. "That you are not cruel, that you have been at times so focused on what you want that you stopped caring enough about the effect of pursuing it. That is not the same, but it is not nothing either." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a fair assessment. I think you should consider making some amends, not for my sake, for yours." "The Garcias," he said, not a question. "They settled over by Tucson. I know because Rosa Vargas has cousins there." He said nothing for a moment. "Then I will write to them." "A letter would be a start," she said. "Money for the barn would be more." He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when she had said something that had gotten past his defenses, something honest he hadn't expected. "You are not easy," he said. "No," she said. "You knew that from the beginning." "I did," he said. "It's why I respect you." "I know," she said. "It's also why I love you," he said, with the same directness he brought to everything, as if it were a fact about the water table. The room was warm and the wind was outside and the words hung there between them, simple and enormous. "I love you too, Vernon," she said, which she did, which was as straightforward as that. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and she stood up from her chair, and the kiss was nothing like the first careful one at the fence. This one was the real thing, the full weight of everything that had been accumulating since a cold October morning and a dead foal in the grass, and the sound of a man weeping over something he cared about past the point of caution. They were married in January 1879, in the small church in Cordoba, which was a ceremony conducted by a circuit preacher named Father Joseph, who came through the territory every 6 weeks, and who performed the service with the no-nonsense efficiency of a man who has married many frontier couples, and understood that the real work was everything else, not the ceremony itself. The town of Cordoba came out for it in a way that surprised Grace and visibly surprised Vernon, who had not expected that people would come in numbers. But they came, Mrs. Farrow and Amos Finch and Rosa Vargas and her husband and children and Thomas from the livery, and the whole broken spur operation in their Sunday best, which in most cases meant a clean shirt, and Sheriff Holt Briggs, who shook Vernon's hand with something in his expression that suggested cautious hope for what this development might mean for the county. Capper cried openly during the vows, which made Grace love him immediately. Dale Purvis stood as a witness with a face arranged in what she suspected was the closest thing to peace she had ever seen on it, and she thought that, for all his previous role in things she didn't approve of, he was genuinely glad for this, which said something. Grace wore the blue dress again, which she had repaired and pressed, and Vernon wore a dark coat that fit him well and stood very straight at the altar, and said his vows in his steady, deep voice without hesitation, looking at her the entire time with the particular directness that was him, always him, the man who looked at what was real and did not look away. The reception was held at the Broken Spur, where Consuelo had been preparing for 2 days and had produced enough food to feed the entire territory, and where someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a guitar, and the evening was lit by lanterns and full of warmth and the particular joy that is both celebration and relief, the feeling of something good having been arrived at against odds. Rosa Vargas took Grace's hands when the dancing started and said, in Spanish and then in English, "Your father would be proud." Grace held on to Rosa's hands for a moment and then let herself cry just a little, which she had not done at the wedding itself, and Rosa did not make a fuss about it, which was exactly right. Vernon found her later when the crowd was thick and the fiddle was going, and he put his hand at the small of her back and leaned down close to say something into her ear, and what he said was, "Are you all right?" "I'm wonderful," she said, and she was. They danced once, just the one, and it turned out Vernon Redmond could dance, not elaborately but solidly, with the same quality of movement he brought to everything. And Grace thought she would remember that dance for the rest of her life. The lantern light and the cold stars outside the open door and his hand at her waist, and his face looking down at her with an expression she had never seen on it before, which was something open and unhidden and young. She moved into the broken spur that winter. The question of her 40 acres was solved naturally, because it was now as much his concern as hers, and she hired Miguel Vargas full-time to manage the farming operation, and maintained her water rights and her deed, and continued to develop the parcel on the practical grounds that it was good land and should not sit idle. Vernon helped her with it not because she needed the help, but because it was hers and therefore it was now also his, and he regarded things that were his with a great deal of attention and care. He wrote to the Garcia family in Tucson. He received a letter back 2 months later that was brief and not exactly warm but was real, and he sent money for the barn, considerably more than the actual cost of it, and Grace watched him seal the envelope with the particular expression of a man setting something down that he has been carrying for longer than he should have. "It does not fix it," he said. "No," she said, "but it's what you can do, and so you do it." He looked at her. "You are remarkably undramatic about ethics." "I think ethics are usually simpler than people make them," she said. "You know what is right. You do it or you don't. The complexity is in making yourself do it consistently." "Is that your father talking?" "Partly," she said. "Partly me." Spring came to New Mexico with a ferocity of green that Grace had not expected, a short window of color and new growth before the summer sun burned it back, and she loved it with the passion of someone who had found a place that matched them. The broken spur looked different to her in spring, less severe, the adobe warm in the light, the corrals full of new foals, the mountains to the north still capped with snow while the valley floor was warming. She spent the spring learning the ranch in a way she had not previously had time for, riding the full extent of it with Vernon on days when the work allowed, which were not many because the work was constant, but when they came were some of the best days of her life. 12,000 acres was a world unto itself, and it had been built into something from practically nothing by a man in his 20s with his particular combination of vision and stubbornness. And she found she was proud of it in the way you are proud of something that someone you love has made. She was also, that spring, learning the ways in which Vernon Redmond was difficult to live with, which was a project that she undertook with the same clarity she brought to everything else. He worked too much. He slept too little. He had a tendency to process difficulties internally without speaking of them until they had grown larger than necessary, at which point he became monosyllabic and tight-jawed in a way she found less charming than alarming. He had a temper that he managed very carefully and very successfully most of the time, and on the occasions when it escaped the management it was sharp and hot and then gone in under a minute, leaving him looking at her with the expression of a man assessing the damage. "You do not need to look at me like that," she told him the first time she saw it. "I'm not going to break." "I know," he said. "I don't like doing that." "Then work on it," she said. "I will tell you when you are getting close to the edge. You tell me too when something is building instead of waiting until it's a pressure head." He was quiet for a moment. "You have thought about this." "I think about everything," she said. "I know," he said, and something in his voice was soft in a way she was still surprised by every time, because it was not the voice anyone in Cordoba County would have predicted coming from Vernon Redmond. But it was there, that softness always available to her, and she protected it accordingly. She went to the foal's grave in April. It was in a corner of the eastern pasture near the creek, which seemed right, and there was no marker because he had not put one, but she knew the place by now. She stood there for a few minutes in the early morning light, which was where she always went to think, and she thought about that October dawn when she had heard that sound in the dark and walked through the fence to it. It was where this had started. Not at the first meeting in his office, not at the fence in the sunlight, not at the supper table. It had started with a sound in the darkness, with grief that was honest and unguarded and exactly itself, and with a woman who had decided to walk toward it rather than away. She told him that evening. "That is where you decided," he asked. "Not decided, understood," she said, "that you were real." He was quiet with this for a moment in the particular way that meant something had gotten through the armor. Then he said, "I should have been embarrassed, a man weeping over a horse in the dark." "Why?" she said. "Because it was too much feeling. That is usually what they say. About you. About men in general, in my experience." She looked at him. "The men who told you that were wrong. Feeling things is not a weakness. Not feeling things is a weakness. You care about your land, your animals, your people, your work. You weep when something you cared for dies. That is not a flaw, Vernon. That is the thing that makes you worth knowing." He looked at her for a long time, and she could see, under the controlled surface of him, the boy from Texas who had been told to be hard, who had taught himself to be hard because hard was what the territory required, who had been hard for so long he had nearly forgotten there was anything else there. "How did you know," he asked, very quietly, "to walk through that fence?" "I didn't know," she said. "I just knew that whatever was on the other side was real, and real things are worth walking toward." He reached across and took her hand, and they sat like that in the evening quiet of the ranch house, with the desert night starting outside and the stars coming up one by one over the mountains. And Grace thought that this was what she had come west for. Not specifically this man or this ranch or this territory, but this quality of rightness, this sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The summer of 1879 was hot and busy and good. The Broken Spur had its best cattle season in 5 years, partly due to the resolution of the water issue which freed up the east pastures, and Vernon gave every man on the crew a bonus at midsummer that Capper told Grace was unprecedented in 12 years of the operation's history. "He doesn't usually do things like that," Capper said, over coffee on a Tuesday morning while Vernon was out on the range. "Maybe he is learning things have changed," Grace said. Capper looked at her with great satisfaction. "Maybe he is," he said. Grace expanded the farming operation on the 40-acre parcel, adding a row of fruit trees that would take years to mature, but which she planted with the patience of someone thinking about what the place would be in 10 years. She started keeping better records of everything, accounts and yields and livestock numbers, and discovered a facility for the numbers side of the operation that Vernon had not previously had anyone to share with him. And they began to work through the books together in the evenings, which was practical and which was also, she found, simply pleasant. She also spent considerable time with Rosa Vargas, whose friendship had deepened through the year into something she thought of as real and durable. Rosa was practical and funny, and had a directness about life that Grace recognized as a sister quality to her own, and they had taken to riding together on Wednesday mornings when the work allowed, just riding out into the landscape and talking. It was on one of these rides in October, a year almost exactly from the morning of the foal, that Grace told Rosa she believed she was expecting. Rosa stopped her horse. She looked at Grace. And then she gave that warm, real laugh that Grace had first heard over coffee in her tent a year ago, and it was, Grace thought, exactly the right response. She told Vernon that evening. She had thought about how to do this and decided that with him, as with everything, the direct approach was best. She simply told him, sitting across from him at the kitchen table where they usually had their evening coffee. He went absolutely still. It was a different kind of still from his usual economical quiet. It was the stillness of someone receiving news that is too large to process immediately. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Fairly certain," she said. "I will see Dr. Pierce in town." He was quiet for another moment. Then he stood up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and crouched down to her level and took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with a face that was entirely open. No armor, no management, just him, just the thing underneath all the hard-built surface. "Grace," he said, and that was all, just her name, but the way he said it. "I know," she said. She confirmed with Dr. Pierce the following week. He was a thin, careful man of 60 who had been the county's physician for 20 years, and who delivered the news with the matter-of-fact warmth of someone who had done so many times, and who never took it for granted. He estimated the spring, around April. Cordoba took the news with the particular interest of a small community, because nothing that happened on the Broken Spur was without significance in the county, and the fact that Vernon Redmond was going to be a father was treated by some people as a harbinger of further changes in a man who had been changing. They said to each other with varying degrees of approval, since the spring before when he had married the girl with the 40 acres. Mrs. Farrow said to Grace at one of their Sunday dinners, "People are saying he is becoming a different man." "He is becoming more himself," Grace said. "That is different." Mrs. Farrow considered this. "You are quite wise for 24. 25 now," Grace said, "and I am mostly just paying attention." The winter was cold and domestic and full, the quality of a house that is alive with purpose and affection. Vernon was attentive in practical ways, which was his language, making sure the cabin she sometimes still used on her parcel was properly winterized even though she rarely slept there, ensuring the house was warm, coming in from the range earlier than was strictly necessary on cold days. He did not fuss or hover, which she would not have tolerated, but she could feel the attention directed toward her well-being in the way the wood box was always full, and the way he watched her at the table, and the way he sometimes woke before dawn and just lay there with his hand against her back, not sleeping, just present. "You're not sleeping," she said one February morning before the light. "I know," he said. "What is worrying you?" A long pause. "Everything," he said. "The foaling season. The spring cattle movement. What kind of father I am going to be." In that order, she felt him exhale something between a breath and a sound. "Not in that order," he admitted. "You are going to be a good father," she said, "because you are capable of caring about things past the point of what is practical, and because you do not run from difficulty, and because you have learned more in the last year about being honest with yourself than most people learn in a lifetime. And because," she added, "I am going to be right here." He pressed a kiss to the back of her neck, which she had come to understand was his most vulnerable form of affection, the one he never did for any reason other than feeling it, and she lay in the dark with the February cold outside the thick walls and felt the particular warmth of a life that was exactly what she had chosen. April arrived with rain, which was unusual enough to be commented on throughout the county, a stretch of gray days that turned the red earth dark and made the creek run high and fast, and the mesquite greener than Grace had seen it. It was into this damp, alive spring that their son arrived, on the 9th of April 1880, in the morning, in the room that looked out onto the working yard of the Broken Spur. Dr. Pierce was there. Rosa Vargas was there as well, which Grace had arranged because Rosa had delivered 4 children, and had a calm practicality in difficult situations that Grace valued at roughly the level of oxygen. It was hard as it was and long, and by the end of it Grace was exhausted in a way she had never been before, a full-body, bone-deep tiredness that felt strangely like peace. And then the boy was in her arms, red-faced and furious and present, and Dr. Pierce was saying things about being healthy and good size, and Rosa was laughing softly, and the rain was coming down outside the window. Vernon came in when they called him. He stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that Grace would remember for the rest of her life. A man entirely stripped of everything except the essential thing. The man himself, the one underneath 12 years of building and hardness and the cruelest man in the territory. And he crossed the room and looked at the boy in her arms and said absolutely nothing. Then he sat down on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time. And the way his face changed, slowly, from that stripped openness into something even further open, something that did not have a word, not love exactly because love was too small for it, something that was love's entire context and everything surrounding it. "Hello," he said to the boy, very quietly. The boy looked at him with the unfocused, ancient gravity of the very new. "His name?" Vernon asked, looking up at her. "I thought Thomas," she said, "after my father." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas Henry Redmond," he said. "Henry was my mother's name before she married." "Thomas Henry Redmond," Grace agreed. Dr. Pierce shook Vernon's hand on the way out and said something quiet to him that she didn't hear, but she saw Vernon nod once firmly, the nod of a man receiving something important and meaning to honor it. Rosa stayed for the afternoon and helped Consuelo with the kitchen and sat with Grace while she rested, and they talked quietly about ordinary things, children and spring planting and the creek running high, and Grace was grateful for it, the ordinariness after the extraordinary morning. Word spread through Cordoba the way word always did, with the particular speed of a small community that is interested in its own story. Cards and small gifts arrived, from Mrs. Farrow and Amos Finch, and from Thomas at the livery, and from people Grace only half knew and some she didn't know at all, because the arrival of a child on the broken spur was the kind of news that mattered to people who had watched the ranch for 12 years and who were, Grace suspected, relieved to see it become something more than an empire. Capper held the boy on the third day with the great care of a man handling something precious and irreplaceable, and his face was a complicated thing, all the years on it and the stories and the weather, and he said, "He's going to be a fine man." "He is going to have a fine example," Grace said. Capper looked up at her and his eyes were bright. "Yes," he said, "both of them." Thomas grew the way children do, with a speed that startled both his parents at regular intervals, and a personality that assembled itself in the first months as distinctly his own. He was a serious baby, and then a serious toddler, watching things with the dark-eyed attention his father brought to everything, but with a readiness to laugh that was entirely his own, erupting suddenly and completely over the simplest things: a dog, a moving cloud, the sound of Consuelo's singing from the kitchen. Grace watched Vernon with the boy with a quiet and complete joy. He was exactly the father she had predicted he would be, attentive and steady and willing to be made a fool of by someone who weighed 18 pounds, which Thomas discovered early was possible and exercised with enthusiasm. Vernon sat on the floor of the main room on evenings when the work was done, and let the boy climb on him with the solemn patience of a mountain, and read to him from the beginning even when the boy was too young to understand, because Grace had told him that the voice mattered before the words did, and he had taken this absolutely to heart. The broken spur continued to grow and to change, the change not sudden but present, in the way that a man's character, when it begins to open, opens steadily rather than all at once. Dale Purvis had a conversation with Vernon in the winter after Thomas was born that Grace was not party to but was aware of, and afterward Purvis was slightly different in manner, more careful, and within the year he had left the broken spur for another operation to the south, with a reference that was honest about his strengths and a departure that was, as far as Grace could tell, entirely voluntary. Santiago, the Mexican cowboy who had been with the broken spur for 7 years, was made foreman, and this was noted in Cordoba with appreciation and in the bunkhouse with the kind of satisfaction that comes from things being set right. Sheriff Holt Briggs, who had been cautious around Vernon for years, came to supper at the ranch house in the spring of 1881, and over Consuelo's extraordinary cooking, managed to have the first conversation with Vernon Redmond that was not about county business in 12 years. It was about cattle breeding and the quality of the spring grass and what the railroad coming through the territory might mean. And afterward, he shook Vernon's hand and said that he thought things were turning out well, and Vernon said he thought so too. And Briggs rode back to town with a look on his face that his deputy described later as the look of a man who has been expecting a storm for years and has finally concluded it is not coming. Grace turned 26 in May of 1881, and Vernon organized a dinner that was more ambitious than either of them usually entertained, inviting the Vargases and Mrs. Pharaoh and Amos Finch and Capper and Dr. Pierce and a few others, and the ranch house was full of people and food, and the kind of noise that indicates a life being properly lived. Thomas, 13 months old and determined to be involved, spent the evening being passed from person to person, with the lordly contentment of someone who has realized he is universally beloved and found this arrangement satisfactory. After the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Vernon gave her the gift he had made, a small carved box in a dark wood she didn't immediately recognize, with her initials cut into the lid and her father's initials on the inside, the schoolteacher from Missouri present in good work. She held it for a long moment without speaking. "Capper taught me," Vernon said, with a slight awkwardness that was rare on him and therefore precious. "He carves things. In the evenings." "I have been working on it since February." She looked at him. "Vernon, it took 3 attempts to get the initials right," he said. She crossed the room and put her arms around him and held on, and felt him hold her back. And outside the window the May night was warm and smelled of sage, and the distant rain coming down from the mountains. And Thomas was asleep in his room, and the 40 acres along Mather's Creek had beans coming in and a row of young fruit trees that would not be mature for several more years but were growing. And somewhere in the eastern pasture, a mare was watching over a new foal that had come into the world strong and healthy and alive in the spring dawn. She thought about October of 1878, about the stagecoach and Mrs. Pharaoh's voice dropping low and the warning that had turned out to be, in the end, not entirely wrong about the facts but entirely wrong about the meaning. They had told her he was the cruelest man in the territory. He had turned out to be a man who wept over a dead foal at dawn, which told you everything true about him if you were willing to walk through a fence in the dark to find out. "What are you thinking about?" Vernon asked, his voice at her hair. "October," she said. "The morning at the fence." She felt him exhale. "That was the strangest morning of my life," he said, "and then there you were. Not a comfortable position for you, being seen like that." "No," he said directly, as always, "but I have come to think it was the best thing that could have happened, because it meant you already knew the worst of it from the beginning. Everything after that was just the truth." She tilted her head back to look at him. "Is that why you trusted me? Because you had already been seen?" He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to things that deserved it. "Partly," he said, "and partly because you walked through the fence toward something instead of away from it. That is not a common thing." "Toward you," she said. "Toward something real," he said, and she heard in this the particular precision of a man who means exactly what he says. "Same thing," she said. He smiled, which was something he did now in private with the frequency it deserved, and in public with the somewhat less frequency appropriate to a man who was still, at his core, Vernon Redmond of the Broken Spur, which was simply his nature and which she had never wanted to change, only extend. The summer of 1881 brought a drought that hit the county hard, the kind of dry hot spell that made the land crack and the cattle lose condition, and every rancher and farmer in the territory walked their fences with tight jaws and careful eyes. The water-sharing arrangement on Mather's Creek proved its worth that summer. The careful allocation of water meaning both operations made it through without serious loss, while 2 other ranches to the west lost significant portions of their herds. Vernon worked through that summer with a focused intensity that she recognized and respected, and she worked alongside him in the ways that she could, managing the farm operation, keeping accounts, riding the fence lines in the early mornings while he was out with Santiago and the hands working the cattle. On the evenings when he came home worn out and heavy-faced with the weight of it, she had coffee and food and Thomas, who regarded his father's return each evening as the best event of the day, and who at 14 months had a word for him that was close enough to his name to count, and which Vernon received each time with the kind of expression that made Grace think that all the years before this had been preparation for this small boy's greeting. The drought broke in September, not dramatically but steadily. A week of rain that came down from the north and soaked the cracked earth and refilled the creek, and made the whole territory smell, briefly, like the beginning of things. Grace stood on the porch of the ranch house in the rain, and felt it on her face and thought about Missouri and her father and the westward deed and the 2 years that had assembled themselves into this. And she was grateful in a way that was not simple or comfortable but was large and real. She realized standing there, expecting again. She had not yet told Vernon. She would tell him that evening directly, at the kitchen table over coffee, the way she had told him the first time. He would go still and then come around the table and take her hands and crouch down to her level and look at her with his face open, and her name in his voice like it was the whole story. The winter of 1881 was mild and the spring of 1882 came early, and on a morning in March that had the sharp, clean smell of the desert after rain, Grace's second child arrived with considerably less difficulty than the first, as Dr. Pierce noted with professional satisfaction, and she was a girl, small and dark-haired. And she opened her eyes within minutes and looked at the room with an expression of acute interest that made Rosa Vargas laugh and say she was already sizing up the territory. They named her Eleanor Alice Redmond, Eleanor for Grace's own mother and Alice for a reason that took some negotiation, but ended with Vernon and an aunt in Texas, who had been kind to him once when he was 7 years old, and whom he had never been able to properly thank. Vernon held Eleanor on the morning she was born the same way he had held Thomas, with the full weight of who he was, not performing it, not managing it, just present and open and real, and he said hello to her too, quietly, and she stopped making noise for a moment and seemed to listen. Thomas came in to meet his sister with the solemnity of a child who has been told something important is happening and is taking the responsibility seriously. He stood on his toes to look into the bundle in his father's arms and then looked at his father's face and then looked at Grace. "Hello," he said to Eleanor in his serious, small voice. She moved her hand. Thomas's face did something wonderful. Capper, when he held Eleanor 3 days later, said she had the look of someone who would know her own mind, and directed this observation at Vernon with a pointed but affectionate expression. Vernon received it with a slight inclination of his head that among people who knew him well was equivalent to a full laugh. The broken spur had reached, by 1882, a kind of settled strength that was different from the driven, acquisitive expansion of its first decade. It was a working operation of great competence and fair treatment, its reputation in the county having shifted through 2 years from the thing that people avoided and feared to something they regarded with a cautious, and then a genuine respect. Santiago Flores, as foreman, had brought in 2 young Mexican cowboys from his own region who were skilled horsemen, and the bunkhouse had a quality about it of men who stayed, rather than the previous pattern of men who moved on quickly. The Garcia family in Tucson had written back a second time after the first money came through, and the letter was still not warm but was real, and Vernon had replied, and there had been a correspondence of some length over the following year. Nothing that resolved everything, because some things do not resolve entirely, but something that faced the history honestly and tried to do what was possible. Grace thought this was the most she could ask of anyone, that they face what they had done and try to do what was possible, and she honored him for it. Her 40 acres had become, by 1882, a small but productive operation that more than paid for itself, the bean crop consistent, and the first of the fruit trees beginning to show their intentions, the creek well managed and the land improving every season. Miguel Vargas, now 19, managed it with a competence that went beyond his years, and that Grace rewarded with ownership terms that would mature into a partnership if he wanted it, which she believed he did. She had drawn up the agreement herself with careful language and had let Dr. Pierce and Amos Finch review it, and it was legal and sound. She had also, through the preceding year, started teaching again. Not formally, not yet, but the Vargas children came twice a week for reading and arithmetic, And then 3 other families from the area began sending their children. And by the autumn of 1882, she had 8 children meeting on Thursday and Friday mornings in the main room of the Broken Spur, learning from a woman who had been taught that education was the thing you could not take from a person once it was given. Vernon provided the space and the materials without being asked, just cleared the room and brought in better chairs and said, when she thanked him, "Your father was a school teacher. This is appropriate." "It is a lot of noise in the mornings," she said. "It is the right kind of noise," he said. On a morning in November of 1882, with the light low and gold and the air crisp and the ranch quiet in the way of a place that is between seasons, Grace stood on the porch of the Broken Spur with her coffee and watched the sun come up over the eastern pasture. Thomas was inside with Consuelo, eating breakfast with the determined focus he brought to all eating. Alina was sleeping, still young enough for the long, drowsy mornings of early infancy. Vernon came out and stood beside her with his own coffee, and they stood in the way of people who have stood in the same place on many mornings and have no need to fill it with anything. The eastern pasture caught the light in a particular way at that hour, the dry grass going gold, and in the middle of it a small group of mares with their foals from that spring season, the foals nearly as big as their mothers now, strong and alive in the morning air. She thought about the foal that had not lived, the one in the cold October grass in 1878, the one that had started everything. She thought she would always think about it, not with sadness but with something closer to gratitude, for being the pivot point of things, for being the place where a story bent in the direction of something better than what it had been heading toward. "What are you thinking about?" Vernon asked, because he had learned to ask and because she had learned to answer. "The foal," she said, "the first one." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the living foals in the morning light. "The mare is well," he said. "She had 2 good foals since, both strong." "I know," Grace said. "I know she did." He put his arm around her shoulders, which he did in the way of someone who has learned that this is available to him and has not yet finished being glad about it. She leaned into him, into his solidity, into the warmth of the man who had been built to be hard and had turned out to contain, underneath all that hard, something irreducible and tender that was the real thing about him, the thing worth finding. The sun continued up over the eastern pasture. The foals moved in the golden light. Somewhere in the house Thomas said something emphatic to Consuelo, and Consuelo laughed. Inside, Alina was beginning to stir. Grace Wells Redmond stood on the porch of the Broken Spur Ranch on a November morning in 1882, with her husband's arm around her and her children inside the house, and the 40 acres along Mather's Creek with its young fruit trees growing in the good soil. And she thought about coming west in a stagecoach with a Colt on her hip and a deed in her trunk, and nothing left to lose and everything still ahead of her, unknown and possible and real. She thought about all the things she had been told and all the things she had found out for herself. She thought the found-out things were almost always more interesting. "I'm inside when you're ready," she said to him, tilting her head back to look at him. "Consuelo is making something that smells like it requires an occasion." "It is Tuesday," he said. "She considers most days an occasion now," Grace said. "I believe she is happy." He looked down at her with that expression she would never entirely get used to and would never stop being moved by, the open one, the one that had no armor and no performance in it, only him. "I believe she is not alone in that," he said. "No," Grace said, "she is certainly not." The sun was fully up over the Broken Spur now, and the light was the clean gold of a desert morning after a clear night, and the land stretched out in all directions, enormous and indifferent and beautiful and entirely theirs, and the day was beginning in the way that good days begin, with everything it needed already present, already whole, already enough. They went inside together. The door closed. The morning continued, as mornings do, with a full and unhurried grace.